This is Brother Peter Diamond, VaticanCatholic.com. New York just signed into law a bill that legalizes same-sex, quote, marriage. Obviously, this is a very bad sign for our country and for this world. It's not enough that these people justify the unnatural activity of homosexuality, which is condemned throughout the Bible as an abomination. No, they must call this shameful, mortally sinful abomination marriage. That's very interesting when we consider that the activity is barren, and therefore if everyone were to become a homosexual, the human race would go extinct. What more proof does one need that the activity is not in accord with nature or with the design of the intelligence that put us here? It's also interesting when we consider that the word matrimony actually means the office of motherhood, which is of course incompatible with the unspeakable so-called union of man and man or woman and woman. And then there is the consideration that if you allow gay, quote, marriage, you have to allow other forms of, quote, marriage. What is to exclude a marriage between more than two people, or between a human and an animal, or between a grown man and a young boy? In fact, it's extremely interesting to consider that the very same arguments that are raised to justify homosexual activity and homosexual, quote, marriage are also brought forward by the proponents of what's called intergenerational love. That is the abomination of sexual relationships between adults and children, which they call intergenerational love. They also argue that they were born that way, and that this is who they are, and that this activity is enriching and fulfilling for all parties involved. Indeed, in ancient Greece, there was actually a tutoring program in which a grown man would tutor a young man or a boy and also engage in sexual relations with that boy. Therefore, it's something that cultures in the past have approved. What is to stop a culture today from approving it? If the sentiments of a culture provide you with your standard for the definition of, quote, marriage, then as soon as the culture deems intergenerational love to be acceptable, it could also be approved as marriage. The point is that once you leave the biblical standard and God's truth, anything can be accepted, and there is no logical basis upon which you can exclude other forms of sexual deviancy from the category of marriage. In fact, the way our culture is headed right now, if it continues long enough, what is now considered pedophilia will eventually be considered an acceptable form of sexual expression or an acceptable sexual relationship. But what I really wanted to talk about is how all of this was made possible by the Vatican II counterchurch, which most people think is the Catholic Church. As many people know, the man who signed the bill into law is Andrew Cuomo, a so-called Catholic who actually goes to a Vatican II, quote, Catholic church in Albany, New York, and he even receives, quote, communion. That is mind-boggling. This guy's not only pro, quote, gay marriage, but he's pro-abortion. He's also living in sin with a woman who is not his wife, and they know all about this, and they don't stop it at all. He just continues to go to, quote, communion. Therefore, the Bishop of Albany, the Vatican II apostate, is just as guilty as Cuomo. He is just as responsible for passing, quote, gay marriage into law as Cuomo, because he could excommunicate him. Any real Catholic would. And in fact, if one of us were in that situation and had a position of bishop, the first thing you do is excommunicate everyone who voted for this bill. They would probably have been excommunicated for other reasons anyway. You would also excommunicate anyone who commented favorably on it, and that would change things right away. That vacuum of Catholic authority has allowed evil to flourish. And people wonder about the concept of loss of office through heresy, or an episcopal see becoming vacant as a result of heresy. Is there a Catholic bishop in Albany? No, there is not. And anyone who would say otherwise is faithless. The case in Albany is a prime example of how an episcopal chair becomes vacant through heresy. There's no Catholic bishop in Albany. And a failure to recognize that principle leads one to the absurdity that a man can remain in Catholic communion while supporting gay, quote, marriage. But not only is Cuomo guilty, obviously, and the so-called Vatican II apostate bishops, but Benedict XVI, he of course knows about this. He knows what's going on. He could excommunicate Cuomo. He doesn't. And that's why it's so disgraceful for these people who think he's a, quote, conservative, putting aside his countless heresies that we've documented. Even when we analyze a simple news event like this, he could stop this. He doesn't. So he's responsible. Benedict XVI is as responsible for passing, quote, gay marriage into law as Cuomo, because he could excommunicate him and he doesn't. It's analogous to the Arian crisis in the 4th century, when people not only had to profess the true doctrine, but they also had to positively condemn the Arians who did not submit to the Council of Nicaea's definition. If they only profess the true doctrine and refuse to condemn and exclude from communion the Arians who did not submit to Nicaea, they were banished with the Arians. And that makes perfect sense, because if you say you are opposed to gay, quote, marriage, but you tolerate within your communion people who support it, you are therefore elevating that evil opinion to the status of something that can be held by a member of the Church of Christ. And that is equivalent to directly promoting it. In fact, to give you an idea of just how front and center this issue is for the apostate hierarchy of the Vatican II Church, the bishops have met with this guy Cuomo. I'm looking at an article right now. It's called A Cuomo Who is Catholic but Hardly Theological. And this article came out a few months ago, that is before this bill was passed which legalized same-sex, quote, marriage. And in this article, a canon lawyer in the Vatican II Church is upset about the fact that Cuomo is being given, quote, communion, despite the fact that he's living in sin. And it says in this article, quote, Mr. Cuomo found time on March 8 to meet the bishops for lunch at his residence. Afterward, Bishop Howard J. Hubbard of Albany said that the question of whether the governor should receive communion was between Mr. Cuomo and his, quote, pastor, end quote. So they're extremely familiar with this individual, and the so-called Bishop of Albany, Hubbard, addressed the situation and said that he is not forbidden to approach communion. That's up to Cuomo and his, quote, pastor. Therefore, the official position of the Vatican II Church is that undeniable, disgraceful public heretics may be given communion. And that's also the position of Benedict XVI. That means that the Vatican II Church officially teaches and practices the heresy that manifest public sinners and heretics may be given Holy Communion. That proves that the Vatican II Church is a non-Catholic sect. Anyone who would not denounce them as non-Catholics is a heretic. By failing to condemn Andrew Cuomo, the one who made the entire gay, quote, marriage law possible, Benedict XVI is just as guilty as Cuomo. He helped pass the bill along with the apostate Bishop of Albany. In addition, I would say that the people who regard these individuals as having Catholic authority, in light of this event, are responsible. Maybe not to the same degree, but they are also responsible. All these phony traditionalists who might be upset about this development, but they still regard the, quote, Bishop of Albany or Benedict XVI as Catholics, even though they fail to exclude from the communion an unspeakable person like this guy Cuomo. Cuomo not only signed the bill into law, but after he did, he was in front of the world proudly giving a speech in celebration of the bill, and he even said that this is an example of how government works well. He is just putting it right in the face of the counter-church. He's being hailed as a hero at gay pride events. And so what we really have here is an example of the amalgamation of Sodom with the Vatican II Church. They have already tried to amalgamate Christ and Satan, but now they're amalgamating Sodom and the church. They're trying to. It's not the true church, but it's the counter-church, because what they're doing by their omissions is allowing the promotion and acceptance and glorification of homosexual, quote, marriage as compatible with the faith of Christ. And actually, it's not just by omission, it's actually by direct action, because they've issued positive statements that indicate that such individuals are not forbidden from approaching communion, let alone excluded from the church completely. So it's not just that they don't say anything, they actually make positive statements that allow it. It's similar to the Ted Kennedy situation. The officials in Boston knew that he was pro-abortion and in favor of all kinds of other things that are incompatible with Catholic teaching. They not only allowed him to approach, quote, communion, but they commemorated him as a servant of Christ after his death. But it really struck me how not only has our culture accepted the activity of homosexuality, they don't condemn it, they've abandoned the biblical teaching against it, but now they're calling it marriage. What an outrage. And it's only possible by the apostasy and the human respect of so many individuals who are heterosexual and even claim to be, quote, Christian or Catholic. They have no idea what they're getting into. They have no idea what they're making themselves responsible for. And then you have Cuomo all over the place being hailed as a hero. This complete and total abomination. So I just wanted to offer a few quick comments about this latest development in New York.